I just want to say, P. Sainath is one of the most outstanding journalists in India. In the mid 1990s, he wrote this book, which he called Everybody Loves a Good Drought. Now, drought is a D word, a dirty word, because journalists then and journalists today find drought to be one of the most drab stories. And the reason for this is that our readers, listeners, are mostly urban city dwellers, elite, who find drought to be very boring. When I was doing journalism classes, when I was in CNN, I would always say, there are no boring stories. There are only boring storytellers. And Sainath is definitely not one of those boring storytellers. In fact, he makes his stories so powerful with one of the best weapons a journalist has, facts. Facts that are so sacred and today has been debased so much. Sainath went on to, that book became a bestseller. He won the Ramon Magsaysay Award. And not one, not two, not 3 years later, but 22 years later, he comes out with his second book. Am I right? It's a second book, 22 years later. That's the kind of journalist. Not so many, but what comes out are gems. Now, this book, he has profiled the freedom fighters, the ordinary citizens of India, the ordinary men and women like farmers, housewives, couriers, cooks, artisans, the ordinary people who helped India win freedom. You know, some people might not know, and many of us have forgotten, that most of the rebellions against the British took place in the countryside, in the villages, not in the city centers. And these were people, these ordinary fighters, freedom fighters, did not go on to become the presidents and prime ministers of India, the members of parliament or ministers or governors. They lived, they struggled, and they died in relative obscurity till they were resurrected by Sainath, who has then honored them for their contribution to Indian history. One of the remarkable things about Sainath is that he is a classic, some would say fuddy-duddy journalist, because he does all these serious journalism, right? But he has used all the tools, the modern tools, to really give the so-called young, hip journalists a run for their money. He has, in this book, come out with QR codes after each hero that he has profiled, so that if you like, if you're more interested, you can actually scan and read more about these heroes. You can listen to them. You can hear the documentaries, hear the interviews. So he has combined both the classic foundational aspects of journalism with all the modern tools, the modern technology that makes journalism even more profound, even more powerful, even more impactful than it ever was. In fact, there is another thing that I would just like to mention. We owe Sainath a debt of gratitude. Why? Because the people that he has profiled are fast-fading generation. The youngest person that he interviewed for this book was 92 years old. The oldest was 107. No, 104, I think. 104 was the oldest. But now, thanks to his efforts, they have been immortalized. Thank you, Sainath.
Good evening, everybody. And I am sitting here with a little bit insecurity because two people sitting along with me are the legends of Indian journalism. And I have great respect for Anita Pratap. I have been reading her articles from my childhood. And also about 26, 27 years ago, that time I was a journalism student in the Kerala Press Academy in Cochin. And that time, Times of India is being read by the people, a few of the Kochi people, because it is being taken through the flight. And that time, we found in one of the pages of Times of India one article, and this column was titled Vox Populi, Vox India. And that was the beginning of Sainath's acclaimed work, Everybody Loves a Good Road. And that time I started reading Sainath. And one day in the city, when I was working as a cub reporter with the New Indian Express, one day I got a call from Sainath. He said he was in Palakkad. He was there to inaugurate a media seminar of Madhrubhumi newspaper. And he wanted to travel to Wayanad and he wanted to report on the farmer's suicide. And I was not believing my words, believing the words what where I am hearing. But he told me, will you be able to travel with me and will you translate to me while my interaction with the farmers there? So that turned a big landmark in my life. I learned a lot in all these years from Sainath. I traveled with him in many places. And the real life situations of the people I understood. And the way he talked to the people, he gathered information from the people. That was a big, great learning experience. And finally, I was able to translate his book, Everybody Loves the Good Road, into Malayalam. And now I am translating his book, The Footsoldiers of Indian Freedom Movement. And so, now, on behalf of all of you, I am asking him a few questions, some questions about the book, also some questions about journalism. And I think there is no need of any kind of introduction of Sainath to this gathering. He visited Calicut several times. He interacted with the people here. He addressed many meetings. And most of the people here are regularly and passionately reading whatever he is writing in PARI, his own portal, and also previously in the Hindu. So, thank you, everybody. So, I am starting the session. And, sir, I already said, now it is almost 26 years I have been reading you. But only one book you written so far, and only now your second book is coming. A quarter century is a huge period. Why you waited all these years to bring out the second book?
Shaji, you know that I do not see myself as an author of books. I remain primarily a field reporter. And I have always believed in the urgency of daily newspapers. Even the previous book was based on a collection of articles already reported in the Times of India. This book too, some of the original pieces appeared in the Hindu Sunday magazine, but half the size and now vastly corrected and updated. And the delay, I've got something like 5-6 books piled up like this, which I don't know how long they'll take. What happened was that in 97, I started working on 50th year of freedom, and I looked at 10 villages where great uprisings took place, including Kaliyasheri, Kannur. But then the agrarian crisis came along and took over your life and mine. It was 300 days a year for the Hindu in the field on the agrarian crisis. I still managed to, in between those trips, look for last living freedom fighters. By the way, since 7 have died, the youngest in the book now turned 98 last month. The oldest is 105, Babani Mahato. So I continued trying to look at it, but if you will look at my writing in the Hindu, I wrote about almost nothing but the agrarian crisis for the next 10-15 years. That story had to be told. And by the way, it's very seriously connected with the freedom struggle and who the people were in the freedom struggle. You know, even in the Singhu Tikri protests, when I was addressing the crowd, there was a lot of glare in my face. And I suddenly realized there were 200 medals looking at me. Because there were 40 ex-servicemen ranging from havaldars to major generals. sitting there, the people whom the media were calling Khalistanis and anti-nationals, yeah, who came onto the stage and told me, as we are speaking to you, our sons and grandsons are guarding your borders. You know? And it struck me then, as it struck me 100 times before. The Indian Jawan is a Kisan in uniform. And that's what that meaning of that slogan, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan. Of course, with the coming of liberalization, we added Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, Jai Louis Vuitton also. But the Indian Jawan was a Kisan in uniform. Those who rose in Kanpur and Meerut in Lucknow in 1857, they were not citizens of those cities. They were villagers, farmers who could not but reflect the mood of the villages. Once again, we are seeing that. Yeah. So the delay was because I could not do it justice and give it time, but it also meant that I was able to interview them several times over years. Then they suddenly started dying. For me, it was almost like they would be there forever, because they were so close to me. Then I panicked and then put it together as fast as I could.
I wish to ask you another question about the context of this book. Because while going through the book, I feel the context, the social context, the political context is very important. Because India has a lot of history books, and this book is a classic example of good journalism, responsible journalism. Also, it is a book of contemporary history. And this is coming out at a time when history of India, whether it is medieval or ancient or modern history, it is getting in large scale misrepresentation or misreading. So I am asking you the context, because it is a kind of secular attempt of exploring India's contemporary history. So is this the context? Is this the political significance?
Of course. See, I would say this about what's happening in history. I think there are still fine historians, far more competent than myself. By the way, my training was as a historian, not as a journalist. I teach in journalism schools. Yeah, meaning I was doing my MPhil PhD when under K.N. Panikkar of Kerala, when I dropped out to become a journalist, and Romila Thapar, Bipin, K.N. Panikkar, these were my teachers, S. Gopal Bhattacharya. Anyway, I think even apart from them, there are many fine historians today whose work is being vilified, targeted, destroyed, books are being burned. The point is that the regime and environment we live in today, it's not just about rewriting history, they're inventing it. They are inventing a history. And please, I request all of you, get onto the internet tonight and look at the Government of India's website, celebrating 75 years of independence. I'm going to take a minute more about this because it's important. The Government of India has a website, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. Okay, 110 crores spent on the first lot of whatever appeared here. Now this website is remarkable in many ways. There is not a single photograph, not a single story, not a single article, opinion on or by, not a single video, not a single quote from a living freedom fighter. There are many photos, and you know whose photos. The same photos you get on everything from ration cards to gas cylinders. You know, a younger generation can be forgiven for thinking that the freedom struggle and independence was led and fought for by Mr. Narendra Modi, though he was born after independence. As far as I know, he wasn't born in 1947, but he's there. He's there telling us about drone technology. He's there, Mr. Modi's speech to the G20. It is outrageous. Yeah, there are living freedom fighters. There's 15 of them in this book. Okay, you could not find one of them to say one word, Probably because you wouldn't have liked the words they had to say. At the bottom, and then there are the attempt, though it says, the website says, celebrating 75 years of independence, they are moving the freedom struggle 800 years back. Okay? The freedom struggle is being shifted 800. Suddenly, Lachit Borphukan, the great warrior general of Assam, who lived only 200 years or 150 years before British colonialism, has been there is there as a freedom fighter. We are moving steadily towards Alauddin Khilji. So you know what the freedom struggle was according to them. At the bottom of the site, there is a section, forgotten heroes, and there are genuine forgotten heroes. There are people there who are best forgotten. And there are also erasures. Erasures, like those of Tipu Sultan and stuff like that. One Indian prince who died fighting the British on the battlefield. Okay? And so you had an extreme attempt at, not attempt, I mean they've succeeded largely at erasure of what the freedom struggle was about. Most important, there is not a single word, not a paragraph on British colonialism and what it did to India and Indians. Nothing, not a word about 31 famines in which tens of millions of people die. Not a word about policy-driven famines. Not a word about how many millions of Indians. You know, by the way, new scholarship is coming up. Just as we are arguing about how many deaths there were under COVID, every reliable source in the world says above 4 million or bottom line 2.5 million. Government of India says 486,000. Very accurate, pinpointed figure. Here's a nation adopting self-delusion as an ideology. Yeah? And you have not a word about colonialism. Then what the hell were we fighting for? What were we fighting against? Why did you rise up against the British? Why did Indians? And that's what we are asking many of the freedom fighters in the book. That's what they're speaking about. They all make this distinction between independence and freedom. The book begins with a line from Ramchandra Shripati Lad, Captain Bhav. He was, which means, by the way, Captain Elder Brother in Marathi. Captain Bhav said in one line, we fought for two things, freedom and independence. We achieved independence. That's it. That's all. In one line, he has just summed up everybody's dilemma. We fought for freedom and independence, we achieved independence. Every one of them makes this distinction between freedom and independence. And every one of them tells you that freedom is a much larger project than independence, which was ejection of British colonial power and self-rule by Indians. So yes, I think it was, the political context is extremely important.
While I am translating this book into Malayalam on behalf of DC Books, I came across many occasions where he was exploring or deliberating the difference between freedom and independence. But in the case of Malayalam, we have same word, Swatantrya. So last time I met Sainath, I asked him how we can translate freedom differently and independence differently. And we were thinking, and then I told him, I will ask some Malayalam scholars. And now I think, Swatantrya, Vimojana, I think Sudhir sir will agree. Okay, then one another question while going through the book. I went to different chapters and I saw different kinds of personalities who represent different political perspectives. There are militant people who taken the militant path. There were people who organized a peaceful kind of protest. But one political ideology, one political party was totally absent in the book. Whether you would name the party or I would.
Please go ahead. It's not a secret.
Thing is that in the India's, the ruling party, the ruling entity, and the organization that contributes its political philosophy, they are not having any kind of representation in this book. What is your response?
Well, many of the freedom fighters themselves address that question. And the simple thing is, I cannot invent a history for people who had no role in the freedom struggle except as collaborators of the British Empire. Yeah. And I've been asked this question repeatedly. By the way, take Shobaram Geharwar, a Dalit freedom fighter, full of beans even now at 97. And I asked him about this. I asked N. Sankaraya. N. Sankaraya and Nallakkannan, 98 and 102 in Chennai. What was the role of different political forces and how come you didn't mention these? They just looked at me and said, where were they? Where were they? We never saw them. Shobaram Geharwar, I asked him, were they not also part of your struggle? He said, वो लोग एक उंगली नहीं कटाया. They didn't suffer one cut on a finger in the freedom struggle. All those freedom fighters were completely dismissive of the political force. Now, since that political force is in power, there is an attempt to build a history, and the most common approach to it. Even this morning at Calicut University, the issue came up to build your own freedom struggle heroes. One, freedom struggle began 800 years ago with Alauddin Khilji. So you can also have freedom fighters. None of them alive to talk to us or be questioned by us. And the second thing is that you had, the question came up of Veer Savarkar. A quick little factual story on Veer Savarkar, where I stand, because I'm asked this question in every meeting on the book. Was he not a freedom fighter? I believe Savarkar was a bona fide revolutionary till 1911. Once he is imprisoned, no other human being, it's a unique distinction from Andamans, wrote 7 mercy petitions begging the British not only to be freed, but begging for a chance to collaborate with the British Empire. If I am released, I will bring millions of misguided youth to the path of British civilization, blah, 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 etc. By the way, there were a couple of others who wrote mercy petitions, and they were extremely mischievous people. You know, there were people who wrote, release me earlier, mother is dying, father is crying, all this sort of stuff. A Gurmeet Singh Lakhon of the founder of the Desh Bhagat Yadgar Hall in Jalandhar, he is released a few weeks early and is back in the Andamans 2 weeks later because he goes and bombs the British Army barracks in Punjab. Okay, they took their release to resume the war against British colonialism. None of them ever said, give me a chance, I will collaborate, I will be your lackey. That's what, and incidentally, before anyone, says anything about this, 5 of the petitions are there. They're in the National Archives. They're published by various authors. Maybe one detailed version of everything is there in A.G. Noorani's book on the RSS. You have a very detailed thing of those 5 petitions. But the most important thing about Mr. Savarkar, in 1926, he was not put under house arrest, but confined to Ratnagiri area. He was not allowed to travel out. A book emerged. I have to tell you this story. A book came up. The life of Barrister Savarkar. Okay? And the author was Chitragupta. Chitragupta was a very commonly used pseudonym in the 1800s and early 1900s, 18th century also, because Chitragupta was the scribe, the accountant of Lord Yama, the Lord of Death. So you had to give him respect, okay? So many people used this pseudonym Chitragupta, and there was a lot of bewilderment. Who was this Chitragupta who wrote this book on Savarkar, the life of Barrister Savarkar? Now, one theory recently floated by the Sangh Parivar was that C. Rajagopalachari was the author of this book because he was a great admirer of, much as I disagree with Rajagopalachari's politics and personality, you know what? The man could write. He wrote bloody well. All of us grew up on his English translations of Ramayana and Mahabharata. He could never have written such an elaborate piece of rubbish as the book. This book gives hagiography a bad name. Okay? That's how bad it is. Anyway, the book is proscribed but circulating. 1942, reprinted by another Sangh Parivar publishing house. Yet there is debate over who wrote it. 1986, it is full of eulogizing hagiographic apologia for Mr. Savarkar. 1986, Mr. Savarkar's brother reveals who Chitragupta was. He reveals it to the publisher of the book, who puts it in the forward note. He says, Chitragupta was none other than Savarkar himself. Now, what do you say about the integrity of an author, a person who writes his autobiography and passes it off as a biography? I read it before knowing that. And then when I knew it, I had to conclude that Mr. Savarkar had a very high opinion of Mr. Savarkar. Yeah. So, you'll please excuse me, there is no such mention of this person in my book. If I was writing about the changing character of Mr. Savarkar, I would definitely bring in the fact that I do concede and consider we should not take away from him that he was a revolutionary before 1911. But much more important is what he did after that.
So, while going through the book, it is largely a book on ordinary human beings who waged an extraordinary kind of battle against an extremely regressive regime. And many people who went through the book, who read the book, told me the introduction is superb. And it was done by a person from the family of Bhagat Singh. So he said the book is missing the kind of philosophy, the people, the propagators of hate philosophy in that book. But it carries a highly emotional, a really touching introduction by Jagmohan. He is from the Bhagat Singh family. Will you talk about that? Will you talk about him?
See, the Jagmohan is probably the last surviving direct nephew. His mother was Bhagat Singh's favorite sister and favorite sibling. When Bhagat Singh returned from Jallianwala Bagh with a bottle filled with the soil, the blood-stained soil, as he believed, of Jallianwala Bagh, they planted it in his garden and grew flowers in it. Each year they did a prayer memorial meeting. The sister who planted those flowers, that was Jagmohan's mother. And Professor Jagmohan is from that peculiar generation, like, these Sankarayas and others, who never seem to get tired or lose energy. When the book was launched in Delhi on November 28th, Delhi winter, Jagmohan, who is in his late 70s, very possibly 80, just stepped onto a bus in Ludhiana and came for the book release. Book release was over at 8:30 p.m. He stepped onto another bus at 11 p.m. and went back to Ludhiana. Okay, I have no... Sankaraya and Nallakande, they wanted to come for the book launch in Chennai. Yeah, and that was the day of the damn cyclone. And Nallakande, we went to... Shankaraya's family said no. He's had COVID twice. We're not letting him out in this weather, in this thing. I understood that. Nallakande was all ready for us to pick him up. When we went there, the Kavita Muralidharan, our colleague, she rang up and said, I'm not bringing him. It was 24 degrees that day in Chennai. In Chennai, that is below freezing point. Okay. People wear two sweaters and mufflers and all that at the time. And she said, his hands are shaking. She said, he is wanting to come, but I don't think we should bring him. I mean, these are the sort of, that generation is made of a particular, made of sterner stuff. They're made of sterner stuff. And you have that. And Jagmohan spent his first year as a child in jail with his mother when she was imprisoned. Okay? At age 3, he was 2 in prison. He was playing with imprisoned members of the Indian National Army of Netaji Bose in prison. Only many years later, he got to know it from his mother. Okay, so it felt for me that Jagmohan was the perfect person to write this book. But as you said, who are the people? They are farmers. See, the thing is, despite the great work done in history by several fine historians, the large idea we have is independence was brought to us by a bunch of returning Oxbridge elites. Maybe, well, Oxbridge Brahmin Baniyas. You know, nobody else did anything. This plays into British historiography, by the way, quite a bit. You know, that Indians went abroad, they learnt about the ideas of enlightenment, they read Rousseau, Locke and Hobbes, and came back with ideas of freedom, which were singularly absent in Indian society. Right? I mean, this kind of racist bullshit. Yeah? It was necessary to show that ordinary people drove the independence movement and the struggle for freedom. You will see how many of the characters in the book do not stop being active after independence. Mallu Swaraj, Shankaraya and Nallakanu go to jail again in 1962, in 1948, in the Telangana uprising. They again go to jail. So the point was that the book, very deliberately we chose, how many freedom fighters do you know who have been recognized who were cooks, couriers, homemakers? The most interesting character in that book, according to everyone who has read it, is Babani Mahato, 104, who spent one whole morning denying to me that she had anything to do with the freedom struggle. She said, that was my husband. That was my husband, Baidyanath. He went to jail for 13 months. By the time we finished interviewing her, Baidyanath Mahato looked like a tiny character besides this woman. She kept saying, all I did, I cooked for people, I grew food. You know what actually turned out? I asked her, and by the way, she spoke to us like we were, favorite but idiot grandchildren. She couldn't understand. She said, what satyagraha, what ahimsa, why are you asking me about all these great philosophies? I was 9 years old when I was married. Okay, that was a blow. But she had done charka for 4 years till then, 5 to 9. What was her role? Her role. I asked her then, finally in desperation, I asked her, so it must have been very tough for you when your husband went to prison for 13 months. She said, no, it was much worse when he came back. Because he brought even more people for me to feed. And then we figured it out. At the height of the Bengal famine, this woman was growing food, transporting it to home, growing it herself, cooking food and feeding not just a joint family of 25, but for 2 months at a stretch, 3 times, she was feeding underground revolutionaries hiding in the forests of Purulia. If that wasn't participation in the freedom struggle, I have no idea what is. Yeah. And it was a far greater role than her husband's role. There are 5 women in the book. This is another group that is always marginalized or reduced to Sarojini Naidu and Vijay Lakshmi Pandit. Here is a Malu Swarajyam. At age 11, was killing Razakars with a slingshot. Yeah. At age 16, she was the leader of all the Dalams in Warangal, in that part of Warangal, which was the main area. Not women Dalams, all Dalams. And one of the beautiful things she said, I think one of the most beautiful lines I've ever heard addressed to young people. In 2014, when she was 84, I put her on a platform in front of 1,500 techies in Hyderabad, then famously touted as Cyberabad. And, we were interviewing her and we asked her, as a journalist, sometimes you hate it, but you have to ask the dumb question, given the audience in mind. And I asked her, okay, the slingshot is great. I've seen hunters in Tamil Nadu and Kerala, Irulas, I've seen Bondas use the slingshot. But is it really effective as a combat weapon, Swarajyam Garu? She got mad. A very short-tempered, short-triggered, short-fused person. She stood up in front of the audience of 1,500, whipped out a slingshot and showed them how it was done, much to the fear of the first 20 rows. Then she looked and saw how scared they were. She removed the cricket ball which she had brought along and said, I will do it without the stone so that you know how it was. And she did it at 84, ramrod straight, and she showed us beautifully how. Then the young techies who gave her 4 standing ovations that day, they asked her, it's all very well for you to say you shot rifles at 16, you fought with slingshot from 11 to 14. What can we do today, in today's India? She held them spellbound, speaking 5 minutes. A woman who did not know a word of English spoke to them 5 minutes about Occupy Wall Street and told them Occupy Wall Street was full of people like you, techies. Okay? And then she gave a line which I will never forget. She told them, you're asking me, she said, I fought for justice. I'm asking you to fight for justice. And she gave this line, the slingshot was my weapon. The laptop and the mobile phone are yours. Use it to fight for justice.
And while going through this book, we definitely feel it is a different kind of approach and it is a different methodology. Because we have many books on Indian independence, and each of the book was celebrating the rich, celebrating the mighty, and of course, as you already said, celebrating the Brahmins. And this book is totally apart from the conventional kind of recording of the events of the Indian freedom struggle. And I am asking, as we know, Sainath hails from a family of freedom fighters, and his grandfather was the Kerala governor, then the president of India. And he had many occasions in his childhood to engage with the powerful people of India's freedom struggle. Then what contributed this kind of transformation? How you turned into such ordinary mortals who extended this extraordinary one?
I don't think I was anything ever but an ordinary mortal. But from childhood, these interesting people I knew nothing about would come and call on Granddad. And he would tell me after that, these were the people who brought you independence, not people like me. Actually, one day, an elderly Scotsman, this was 1961, elderly Scotsman came to see my granddad. I was not yet 4 years old. I knew my granddad was somebody important. I didn't know what, but I knew he was damn important, right? And I would be sitting on his table while he worked, and he got me, by the way, apart from addicted to the freedom struggle, he got me addicted to South Indian filter coffee. An adventure which ended one day when my grandmom came in and found me drinking dark filter coffee. Cups and saucers flew all over the place in her anger. But this elderly Scotsman came and called on my granddad. And he said, do you remember me, Giri? And my granddad said, I know you. But it must have been 30 years. I'm not able to place your name. Who are you? He quietly opened a piece of cloth, a strip of cloth with 6 or 7 numbers on it, and gave it to my grandfather, who started laughing. He looked at it, there were tears and laughter in my granddad, and he asked that man, "Why did you keep this?" It was my grandfather's convict number in prison, and he was my granddad's warden, prison warden. He said, "I kept 6 or 7 of you guys. I had an eye on you fellows. I thought," he was an elderly person speaking like that, "I had an eye on some of you I thought would amount to something in life. So I retained them." And then as he left, he tapped me and said, "Behave yourself, okay? Be good. I threw your grandfather in prison." I was traumatized, okay? I thought my granddad was somebody very important. Here I was being told that he was a criminal convicted prisoner. And that's where my interaction with the freedom struggle started. As I began to ask him, "How were you in jail? What crime did you commit?" And every time someone would come who was his co-prisoner, a fellow prisoner, he would say, "Do namaskaram to this man. He did this great fight and struggle and strike in the railway strike. He brought you independence." So it was always clear to me that it wasn't just the elites who did that. The other miswriting or misreading is that many of us grow up thinking the freedom struggle was up north, primarily in UP and Bihar. Actually, in the east, they were rising and fighting against the British, against the East India Company, within 3 years of the Battle of Plassey. Okay? And from the 1760s to 1800, the horribly misnamed Chuar rebellion. Historians, basically upper caste historians, have dubbed that the Chuar in Bengali is not just chor, it is chor plus neech, which tells you that the people in the rebellion were Adivasis and Dalits. That's why it's so important that Shobharam Geharwar is highlighted in the book. Okay? 40 years they resisted until they were literally wiped out. And this is before the Santal Hool, 50 years before the Santal uprising. So it was very important that, you show that this was a pan-Indian movement. And I'm going to tell all the young people in this audience, I've told, and I'm pleased to see how many there are, and I will tell you this. Some of you guys are young enough, 17, 18, 19, to have even great-grandparents alive. I'm telling you this. Go back, speak to your grandparents and if possible great-grandparents. You will find that every family had a story about the freedom struggle. There may be 0.1% of those families who had a very ignoble history, but by and large, you're only going to find families. You're going to find that your family was involved in the freedom struggle. It was such a wide spectrum, such a huge area. So I always had a different understanding, but came to learn what I learned. If you ask me, what did I take away from these people politically? I have learned not to pigeonhole them. Shobharam Geharwar, a Dalit, self-declared Gandhian, admirer of Ambedkar, who tells me, "You've come in a jeep. It's April 14, Ambedkar Jayanti. Take me to the central market of Ajmer. I want to garland Ambedkar." And this self-declared Gandhian was making bombs from the age 11. Traveling about trains, couriering bombs to different parts, couriering underground correspondence, even appeals to Ambedkar, which he delivered in Baroda when Ambedkar was working there. I asked him, "Shobharamji," quaking, because I knew, by the way, many of these guys are pretty cantankerous and short-tempered, like Mallu, Shobharam. I asked him, quaking in my shoes, I asked him, "Shobharam, given the present debates, how did you choose between Gandhi and Ambedkar?" he took serious offense. He said, why should I choose? You choose? Those principles of Mahatma which I admired, I followed those. Those principles of Baba Saheb that I admire, I still follow those. And then he gave me a phrase I had never heard. He said, Dekho, maine dono nadiyan mein gaye. I was in both rivers, both streams, Gandhivad and Krantivad. A lovely phrase. The Gandhian path and the revolutionary path. I was in both streams. Dono nadiyan mein gaya maine. And the point about it was that I realized that these guys, Telu and Loki Mahato in Bengal, in Purulia, their hero obviously as Bengalis was Netaji Bose. Their national figure was Gandhi, whom they would never see in their lifetime, but an awe-inspiring figure. And their immediate heroes were three dacoits in the Hobsbawmian kind of social bandits. Three dacoits. They admired these three dacoits because these three dacoits fell into the Robin Hood kind of category. Fighting for, there were three tribals called the Butij tribe that was severely dispossessed by the British very early. So, how do you have, I then realized that this generation, and at least the hundreds whom I met, they were leftist, staunchly leftist by political persuasion and Gandhian by moral code and principle. You and I might see a lot of that as contradictory. Shobharam did not see it as contradictory. Telu and Loki Mahato did not see it as contradictory. They were open to multiple influences of their time and at different times responded to those influences. The only influence they did not have any respect for, as Bhagat Singh Jugia says in the book, he mourned what was happening, but then he said, Dekho bete, the sun will set on this Raj as well.
So the time is running out. But anyway, any conversation with Sainath would be incomplete without asking about the state of journalism in India. And fortunately or unfortunately, the three people on the dais, they are destined to do journalism till their last breath. And I'm sure most of the people in front of us, they have very highly critical observations on the state of journalism in India. So I just asking you, what is the journalism today in India, the post-pandemic situation, and also under this difficult kind of regime?
Shaji, here I was so happy and exuberant to discuss all these people, and you ask me what is the state of journalism in India. Okay? I mean, listen, journalism has been reduced to two schools, right? There is journalism and there is stenography, right? And 85% of what you see in your media is stenography. And I better quickly add corporate stenography, because incidentally your media and entertainment industry, which is one industry, M&E as it's called, is worth 1.81 trillion rupees as of today, and projected figure for March 31st next year, just in time for the elections, the media entertainment industry will be worth 2.31 trillion rupees according to Ernst & Young in their annual report on media values. You have a complete corporatization of media. None of these, not a single channel or portal or newspaper, I refuse to call them mainstream. No newspaper or channel that excludes 75% of your population can be referred to as mainstream, because it's excluded the mainstream. They are corporate media. Okay? And how they functioned, you saw. Oh, by the way, not one of them told you in April 2022 that the great tradition of Indian journalism was observing its 200th anniversary. The founding of Miratul Akhbar by Raja Ram Mohan Roy. By the way, a paper not in Bengali but in Persian. Much to the chagrin of my Bog friends, he started that paper in Persian, which was then the language of the elite of the Mughal court, etc. Now, the most remarkable thing he did A riot called Pratap Narayan Das was sentenced to flogging by the district judge of Komila, now in Bangladesh, then called Camilla, like the Duchess, but anyway, like the Queen or whatever she's called now. Komila district in Komila town in Bangladesh. The judge sentenced him for some minor offense to be flogged. The police flogged him, he died. Raja Ram Mohan Roy wrote a moving, powerful editorial that James Buckingham, everybody, all the English journals translated it into English. Every Indian journal worth the name carried it. The highest court of England of that time summoned the district judge to approach before it and explain. Tell me, did you see anything like that happen when Siddiq Kappan spent 2 years in jail? Yeah. There were individuals amongst us who wrote to the CM, please get him legal representation. Please help him. Please make an appeal. Where were the media for their fellow journalists? In 2 years, about 100 FIRs have been filed against journalists. Yeah? And some of them have been charged under laws. There are now 58 laws affecting media in this country. Many colonial laws resurrected. In Tamil Nadu, Sam Raja Pandian of City East was charged under Diseases and Epidemics Act. The last journalist to be charged under that was a fellow called Bal Gangadhar Tilak. Now, look at this. I mean, the sheer state of journalism. But this starts with corporatization. In the last 40 years, most newspapers in the old days were started by freedom fighters. In the 60s, 70s, they collapsed financially and the business houses take over. By 80s, Mr. Samir Jain comes and changes everything. And Mr. Vineet Jain tells the New Yorker 20 years later, we are not in the newspaper business, we are in the advertising business. And his general manager tells New Yorker, you can call us a large equity firm with significant media holdings. And at the time he said this, the Times of India was the largest circulated English newspaper on planet Earth. Okay? They themselves are telling you that they don't give a crap about journalism. It has nothing to do with what they are doing. Corporate ownership means the bottom line is the bottom line. Profit is everything. You will be, by the way, they haven't mentioned a word about the last heroes. Though I'm a Times fellow whose book Everybody Loves a Good Drought, they had it reviewed on the front page by the late Nikhil Chakravarti. But this book, there is an absence of the RSS and Hindutva in it. They have carried a major item on a book on Hindutvavadi heroes, another history book, conveniently about people whom you cannot talk to or interview or verify. Journalism is a discipline of verification. Right? So you have this kind of situation. The media are at their lowest point. However, it's astonishing to me that with this kind of repression, that 100 journalists are standing up and inviting FIRs against themselves, that they, like a Siddiq Kappan is jailed for 2 years, that many others have been jailed, charged with bogus offenses, and all of us know that our time is coming. Okay? We know it. I'm saying that tradition, the greater tradition, however small, it still lives.
Thank you very much. Now we have very few minutes and it is open to the public. You can ask any specific, straight, simple questions.
Mic, yeah, give him the mic.
Good evening, sir. It's a straight and simple question about the book. How influential was communism among the foot soldiers of Indian freedom? That's the first question. And the second question is actually related to journalism, in fact. I have seen a declining trend of cartoons and caricatures in Indian journalism. So do you think that is a phenomenon that we should be worried about because famously during the emergency, caricatures and cartoonists were actually the mouthpieces of Indian freedom.
Yeah, I get it. I'll answer your second question first. Yes, you're right. There is a huge decline even in the number of cartoons and an even greater decline in the subject of the cartoons. There are people whom you cannot caricature. You lose your job. The government doesn't have to punish the cartoonist. His newspaper proprietor does it. His newspaper punishes her or him when they have cartoons that are disrespectful of Mr. Modi. Now, but I have to bring one piece of information to your attention here, please. On the question of journalism and the decline. In 2020, the Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders, ranked India at 142 in Freedom of Press Index, which of course we immediately declared to be a conspiracy. You know, we live with this dual, I don't know how we reconcile it, Anita. On the one hand, they tell us every day, Mr. Modi has transformed India's image in the world. You know, India had nothing before him. At the same time, every index that shows how horribly off we are is denounced as a global conspiracy. Now, you can't have it both ways. If he's changed the image, he's changed the image. Right? Then how come, why are they needing to have 100, India is 132 in the United Nations Human Development Index. 150 now in the World Press Freedom Index. 180 out of 180, an impossible score in the Environmental Performance Index of Columbia and Center and Yale University Environmental Center, and 106 out of 107 out of 121 in the Global Hunger Index, the ultimate conspiracy. Yeah. So you should, about the repression and the curbing of journalism, the government of India was very angry. By the way, the governments of India, regardless of which one, always get more upset when the criticism comes from Goras. Okay? When it comes from white Europeans and Americans, that is absolutely a conspiracy. Because we cannot be seen that way. We are not that way. So the senior most bureaucrat in India, the Union Cabinet Secretary, asked the Information and Broadcasting Ministry to form a committee to rebut the Reporters Sans Frontières. Now, a directive coming from the country's top bureaucrat. The Union Cabinet Secretary is a man who takes his orders only from one person. Maybe in the present dispensation, from 1.5 persons. I don't know which one is the half. Okay, so they formed the committee, packed it with bureaucrats and researchers from bureaucratic positions in government institutions. And then suddenly someone thought, hey, you know, we are studying press freedom. It might be a good idea to have a couple of journalists as well. So we had a committee of 13 people, 11 bureaucrats, 2 journalists, 11 government officials, 2 journalists. I was one of the 2. The other journalist, you know him, I never believed in my life that a television anchor was capable of silence. But he said not a word in 2 meetings, full meetings of the committee, which also had many subgroups, which is where we counted that there are 58 laws that affect media in this country. Now I had to do all the talking, and it was very pleasant. I made a condition. I am only joining your committee if your aim is rebuttal of RSF, Reporters Sans Frontières. Count me out. Because if I did a ranking, you would not be 142, you would be much lower down. The chairman of the committee, head of the DG of the PIB, said, "No, Mr. Sainath, we are here to study press freedom. We assure you of this." Incidentally, it was all on Zoom and I have recorded the meetings. So then, whatever point I made about Kashmir, about the sheer torment and torture of denying a people, breaking down their internet and their phone for 6 months at a time. Yeah. Everything that I said, the chairman would say, very important point, it should be noted, it should reflect in the report. Both he and I were old veterans of different government commissions and we both knew the dance. Okay? So we knew as what finally happened. Not a word of what I said appeared in the report. And they sent this out as a draft report, remarkable for the absence of the word draft. They were going to, and how did they intend to get it past me? The first paragraph is eulogy and praise for yours truly. How much I contributed to, how much I contributed to this thing. And then I wrote a note of, you can call it independent note, dissent note. They wrote, the security forces are playing a heroic role in protecting security and freedom of expression of journalists in Kashmir. I said, I want to hear what the Kashmir journalists have to say about this. Let's have hearings. Let's bring them down and let them tell us what they think about it. Okay, I sent in the note. A committee appointed at the behest of the senior most bureaucrat in the country, the committee disappears into cyberspace. I sent the report 3 times. The email ID of the committee disappears. RTIs are done by the country's leading RTI experts. Yeah? And the answer is, was there such a question? Was there such a committee? Did it meet? 1 and 2. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. What did its report say? Is there a report? The answer of the RTI says, yes, committee exists. Yes, it had these members. Yes, it had 4 full meetings and subgroup. Questions 2 to 8. Not our department. That's where. And on communism, it had a profound impact on those in the freedom struggle. Yeah. But also there are many people who began with that impact who went into other parties like Captain Bhav and Hausabai. They went from Tufan Sena towards peasant and workers parties. Shetkari Kamgar Paksh of Maharashtra. So people went into it. But every one of them would tell you that Marxism was a huge influence. Telu and Loki Mahato remain sworn leftists to this day. Yeah, but I have learned that they were also influenced by other forces, like the greatest mind of Indian communist movement, EMS Namboodiripad, whom I count as the most original mind on the left in India, who always had a photo of Gandhi in his office, and who wrote a book, a beautiful book, The Mahatma and the Ism. So there was virtually nobody who was not influenced by him. Even those who killed him were influenced by him negatively enough to kill him.
Thank you. And humble apologies. The time slot allotted for us is now over. So there is no situation, no...
There's one question. Can we take one question?
More questions.
One more question.
They want to...
Okay, well, just let him ask one question. I'll answer it quickly. And
Quickly, better than
yeah. Quickly, please.
I'm just asking a follow-up question. You were talking about, there's actually problem. We are talking about today what is happening in India and how present dispensation controlling the media. And after you, what is the solution?
Oh, by the way, the present dispensation hardly needs to control the media. The media owners are doing it for them on their behalf. Yeah? And many journalists have also, senior journalists, have ended up accepting self-censorship, going into that mode. What is the solution? I wish I had a blueprint which, I can give you a bottle of magic elixir and you'll solve it. But the solution is this, what those freedom fighters in the book are saying. We have gained independence. The fight for freedom is far from over. And you can find those ideas, the finest distillation of the freedom struggle and its idealism, are there in the, I believe, in the Constitution of India. Justice for all, social, economic, political, justice, liberty, equality, fraternity. And I will end on this note. Young people in their teens, late teens, in 2019, in the anti-CAA, NRC agitations, what were thousands of young college students and high school students reading from at the protests? Justice for all, social, economic. There is a continuity of resistance from the days of the freedom struggle to this day. If we recognize it, we join it.
Thank you very much. Actually, listening to Sainath is a great learning experience. And when I came here, I told one of my friends to come here and listen to his speech. And that friend said, it may be in English and he's he's not much comfortable in listening English. I told him, he's talking in a different kind of language. That is concerning you and me. And it is a different kind of communication and you will understand. I hope that person is here. So I think we all have got some ideas, some kind of information, some thought process. And it is a process of igniting our forcing us to rethink on our priorities, our perceptions. Thank you very much once again. Thank you, Anita Pratap. Thank you, Sainath.